Hi guys, and welcome to today's Money Honeys video. This is going to be another Money Honeys Buzz talking about a topic that has to do with finance. If you are watching me for the first time, welcome. Feel free to watch this all the way through. It's a very standalone topic, but these topics are all sort of based around my financial foundation path. And if you're interested in that, at the end of this video and down below, I will put a link to my Money Honeys series, which is a series of achievements to get through to get a firm financial foundation for yourself. But today we are going to be talking about budgeting for people who are in high school, university, or perhaps first out of post-secondary and are still living with their parents. Basically, when I've talked about budgets in the past, it's often been with the idea that it's somebody who is renting their own place, somebody who has a mortgage, somebody who is working, and what does that budget look like if you are not in those phases of your life? Now, what I'm not going to talk about here is budgeting or how to manage money for really young kids. You can find a number of articles about that, about how you should help them split up allowance, what you should do in terms of how to give out allowance. I'm not an expert on that. I don't have children, but there are lots of resources out there for you. What I want to talk about is when you are perhaps older in high school and you start to make some of your own money, or you do have an allowance or something like that, when you are in post-secondary and after post-secondary. So let's talk about this in a broad sense. Basically, I have given you before a rough idea of percentages of your budget. So for your net income that you get, generally what percentages you should be spending in each area of your budget. And that is 35% for housing and everything related to housing, 15% for transportation, everything to do with your transportation, gas, car payment, insurance, maintenance, all of that. 10% for long-term savings, and that's really like retirement savings. 15% for debt repayment, should you happen to have debt. And 25% of your net income for everything else in your life, which is like your food, your clothing, gifts, vacations, all of the rest of it. So that is really something that makes sense when you are in the working world, when you have your own place, because it's your housing, it's your net income coming in, all of that. But what happens when you are in high school? Let's start with that. And I'll tell you why this topic came to mind. If you watch the other videos on my channel, they are very makeup review based, skincare review based. And you may notice that I do a lot of drugstore stuff or subscription boxes. Those tend to be my two things. And part of the reason for that is I want to get myself some more Sephora stuff. Like, there is room in my budget for me to get some more high-end makeup, that kind of thing. But I walk into Sephora and I look at a lipstick that's going to cost me $30 and I just balk at that price. Like, paying that much for it is really hard for me. I've worked hard to earn the money. There are other things, that $30 is a good chunk of my grocery budget for the week. So it's just very hard for me to look at like a $55 highlighter or a $60 foundation, and parting with that money is very difficult for me. However, I have to say at the same time, part of what puts me off of Sephora a little bit is the people, and generally women, not always, but young women who are in there, the age range skews very young. So it looks like a lot of young women who are in high school still and perhaps university, that age, going and buying things. And I often overhear things when I'm in there like, oh, I just can't help myself when I'm here, things like that. And I fully acknowledge that I don't know somebody else's life situation. They could have a ton of funds and budgeting properly and everything, but it puts me a little bit on edge when I see young women who are blowing huge amounts on makeup, and I just want to hopefully put out there how you should be managing things, because makeup isn't as important as security, as education, as getting a good grounding in the priorities of life. So that is where this video came from, is trying to put some more information out there, because I feel like I see people whose priorities might be perhaps a little off. If you are in high school and you are getting income either from a part-time job or from allowance, something like that, let's think about what you want to do with it. Yes, a certain amount of it can be spent on having fun, things like that, but let's think about that overall budget pie. Now, you're not going to have a mortgage and housing. Generally, you're probably living at your parents' place and you don't need to pay for that. The next piece that you probably don't need to pay for is debt repayment. Hopefully, you do not have any debt. Being young, and oftentimes you cannot, thank goodness, get credit cards or anything like that when you are a teenager, so you probably shouldn't need to be putting 15% into debt repayment. And then there's also that 10% in there for savings. And usually when I talk about savings, I am talking about saving for retirement, but I'll get to this in a second. So you really are going to have 60% of that budget pie, which is not really that applicable to you when you're in high school. Now, the problem here is you can think, that's awesome, I get to spend my money on everything that I want to, and, buy makeup, buy clothes, go out for fun times, and I want you to do that. But I want you to do that with the 25% of the category that is life. I'm still going to leave the 15% in there for transportation, because oftentimes you have a car, or you're paying for your own insurance, your own gas, or you're going places on transit. You need that 15%. But I would still try to say to keep your transportation within 15% of your budget. I know that if you are a high school student and you are working a part-time job or getting allowance, it's not very much money. So 15% of whatever you get may not seem like much, but you also should be, hopefully, being very cheap. You probably won't have a brand new car. You might have like an old beater or something your parents passed down to you, and you're using that 15% for either a very small car payment or just for a minimal amount of gas and insurance on your car. 25% of your budget could go towards all the fun things, your makeup, going out to the movies, getting new clothing, all that kind of stuff. 25% of your budget. And 60% of your budget should be going to one of two things. If you are planning to go on to post-secondary education, university or college, 60% of the money that you bring in, I would recommend saving for post-secondary. Post-secondary education is incredibly expensive, and you don't want to be saddled with a lot of debt when you come out of it. So the more money you can put aside ahead of time, the better you're going to be setting yourself up for your future. Not only is there tuition, a lot of people live away from home, and they need to have meal plans or food. Again, still transportation. So the more money you can put away, the better. Think of post-secondary education savings as your number one priority. It is just so important that you get as much money into that as you can so that you're not coming out with a lot of debt. If you are not planning on going on to post-secondary education, you're going to be finishing high school and then looking for a job, I would really consider putting that 60% into a fund to help you with moving out, to help you with your first expenses, to start putting away savings. Basically, I don't think you should think about saving for retirement when you are in high school. You should think of those savings either for post-secondary or sort of a start your life fund until you get into your first job. And if you go right out of high school and into your first job, as soon as you get it, then start doing the other budget that I talk about with the 35% for housing and 15% for transportation and the 10% for long-term retirement savings. But until then, while you are in high school, it's either post-secondary education or you're starting your life fund. When you actually get into post-secondary education, if you're going to university or college and you are either working part-time while you are there or you're working in the summers and perhaps not part-time when you're there, I'm going to say that you are trying to spend as little as life and transportation as possible and put everything you can towards post-secondary or towards, your living situation, things like that. Basically keep all costs minimal, because what you are trying to do at all costs is come out of university or college with as little debt as possible. I would even say that even if your parents are paying for all of your education, I would still sit down with them, and this is going to be so hard to do. This is so easier said than done for you, not for your parents. But sit down with them and say, I want to contribute to it, and pay for a certain amount of it. I think you have so much more investment in your education when you are paying for it yourself. You're going to be much less likely to skip classes, to drop things, to, skimp out on studying if you are working for the money to pay for that education yourself. So while you are in college or university, you spend as little on life as possible, as little on transportation as possible, and put as much as you can into tuition during the time that you are there. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about is what happens when you leave post-secondary or you leave high school and you get your first job, and a lot of times, especially now, people end up living back with their parents again. So when I finished university, I went back to live with my parents, and I saved up as much as I could, as fast as I could, to sort of get my first and last month's rent together and a little bit of funds saved up to move out on my own. And that was my goal to do as soon as I could. Now, there are a lot of people who are totally fine living with their parents, and for a lot of people in a lot of cultures, the expectation is that you do live with your parents, perhaps until you're married, until you're a certain age, whatever that might be. Here's what I want to warn you about, is there is a new term now, and I think this is fairly new, for people who are in their entry-level jobs, or perhaps retail jobs where you're not making a huge amount of money. You're making good money, but you're still very much starting your career, and you are living at home, so you have very few expenses and you have a lot of disposable income. And the term for that is gold collars. You may have heard terms before about like blue collar worker, and that would be more working class. White collar worker, where somebody is more working in a cubicle or an office environment. Gold collar worker is somebody who is working a job where they're not making a huge amount of money, but they are in a living situation where all of it is going to disposable income. So you can have an amazing lifestyle on very little money. Because again, if we think of that pie, if you are working making, let's say, $35,000 a year, which would be a little bit hard to live on if you were paying for your own rent, paying for your own food. But if you're living with your parents and perhaps your only bills are, your cell phone, your car insurance, and the gas in your car, and everything else is disposable income, you can have a fantastic lifestyle. The problem is that you are never going to have that lifestyle ever again as long as you live. If you move out, if you get a mortgage, if you have to pay your own rent, if you have to save up for your future. So the problem that people are having is that when they're living at home, they are spending all their money on fun things. And then there's the expectation that this is what life is going to be like. So I would suggest, if you are somebody who is living at home with your parents in your first job, that you make a plan on moving out and living on your own or living with a roommate, because that's really going to get your life started. But in the meantime, 35% of your income that is not going to housing is going into an account to save up for the first place you're going to live. Whether that's first and last month's rent, whether that's a mortgage down payment, put that money aside into its own account. 15% for debt repayment. Again, hopefully you have no debt, but if you have student loans, you're going to have money going towards debt. Put that towards debt. Start doing the 10% towards your retirement, because the earlier you start, the more money you get, and then still live on that 25% as your actual life. It is going to do so much for you in terms of getting you ready for what the rest of your life is going to be like, and not setting expectations too high for the kind of disposable income that you're going to have in the future, and also just gets you really into that routine of tracking your money, of saving for the future, and you're going to be that much more responsible as your income rises, as you go out on your own, and as you make plans and move through life. So that is today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please consider giving it a thumbs up. I would really appreciate it. If you've not subscribed and you're liking these kinds of videos, you can click on the subscribe button, which is probably down below, or on my face, which will appear at the end of this video. If you have any questions at all, please feel free to leave them in the comments. I respond to every comment that I get. If your question is a little bit more personal, I have an email address down below. You can send it to me that way. And I look forward to seeing you in my next video. Bye.